The work was brand new. The work was fresh. No one had really done it in quite the way she had done it before. So the fact that she was a woman was incredibly important. This had been very much a male domain, especially experimental fiction in America. It belonged to men.
Kathy Acker comes from an affluent Jewish family and grew up in the wealthy district of Midtown Manhattan. However, she rejected the comfort and security of her parents' world. Today, her life revolves around the district known as Soho, near the southern tip of Manhattan. Soho is as distinct an area as Chinatown or Little Italy, and its few square blocks house the chic community of New York's avant-garde. Like Greenwich Village in the 50s and early 60s, it's the hub of the city's artistic life. This once poor district has become one of the wealthiest and most fashionable parts of Manhattan. Kathy Acker, like many of the latest generation of young artists, lives to the east of Soho in an area known as the Lower East Side. It's one of the roughest parts of New York, and it's a constant theme in her writing.
This is the Lower East Side. This is the beginning of the Lower East Side. And what it's the last poor section left of this part of Manhattan. And, I mean, I'm living here now basically because it's the only place I could afford to have this much space. And what's happening in the section now, it's been Puerto Rican. And this building, up to 3 years ago, was the main building where a lot of the junk trade was happening. In fact, in this apartment, there were 13 murders, I think 3 or 2 years ago. And what happened after that is the building became bombed out. This was mainly all either bombed out territory or very poor Puerto Rican families. Slums of New York City. A racially mixed group of people live in these slums. Welfare and lower middle class Puerto Ricans, mainly families, a few white students, a few white artists who haven't made it are still struggling, and those semi-artists who, due to their professions, will never make it. Poets and musicians, black and white musicians who are into all kinds of music, mainly jazz and punk rock. In the nicer part of the slums, Ukrainian and Polish families. Down by the river that borders on the eastern edge of these slums, Chinese and middle class Puerto Ricans. Avenues of junkies, pimps, and hookers form the northern border. The southern border drifts off into even poorer sections, sections too burnt out to be anything but war zones. And the western border is the avenue of bums. All of the buildings are either burnt down, half burnt down, or falling down. None of the landlords who own the slum live in their disgusting buildings. In the winter, when the temperature averaged 0 degrees, these buildings have no hot water or heat. And in the summer, at 100 degrees average, roaches and rats cover the inside walls and ceilings. I was just nervous about the safety here when I moved in. I was very nervous, but I feel very safe here. I mean, actually living where there's a large hooker trade is a very safe neighborhood.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, they think I'm a hooker, and no one mugs a hooker. Because the Puerto Ricans, once you're part of the neighborhood, you're part of the family. And they just don't want trouble on the streets. So as long as you fit into the neighborhood, you're fine. When Janie thinks she has to see people because she's going crazy, or it's not good for her to be alone all the time, even though she loves being alone and doing nothing, when night strikes, and only at night, she goes out of her room and walks the streets. She walks up and down the same streets the hookers walk, only the hookers make some money. The junkies, petty gangsters, bums, and pimps occasionally say hello to her. After a night or two, Janie hates walking the streets, doing nothing, so she goes back to her room and does nothing. So New York, 1979 was the end of that period. I remember it was the death of Sid Vicious and James Chance's girlfriend, Anya, who willed herself to die. And after that, there was just, I couldn't do it anymore. Plus, I had a lot of personal disasters happen to me that threw me into a tizzy. That's a mild way of putting it. I just broke down. I left New York for 2 years. And when I came back, I had made certain resolutions.
What resolutions had you made? May we know about that, or is that?
To look for some stability that wasn't in any way oppressive to anybody. You know, it's a way of accepting something that you might not believe in, but it's a better way of doing it. It's like a tool. It's like fiction. To use fiction as a way in my life and in my writing. That you know it's a bit fictive, but it's a hell of a lot better than what the reality seems. And after a while, you learn that the fiction becomes reality.
It's a characteristic of the avant-garde that each new movement builds on the one that preceded it. The tradition of writing that Kathy Acker belongs to has its origins in the work of American writers like Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, whose attitudes to language were very different from those of the literary mainstream. They developed an improvisatory, often disjointed way of writing. Burroughs used to scramble his own and other people's words in what he called cut-ups, slicing up a piece of prose and juxtaposing it with something from entirely different sources.
The way I started writing, to my mind, was imitating Kerouac and Burroughs, who were my two, because I wanted to write prose, but I was in a poetry world. But I got very bored of autobiography. I got bored of hearing myself scream. I got bored of the sound of my own voice. And I never wanted to express anything. I was also taught that the way you write when you become a mature writer is you find your own voice. But I didn't seem to have a voice anywhere. I mean, I probably was, you know, the word schizophrenia, whatever that means, there was a lot of it in me. But anyway, I just couldn't find, what I really loved to do was read and to imitate people. And also, I had so many poetry classes, I was revolting against everything I was taught. I mean, it was as if I just hated, I hated my fathers. You know, the people who had taught me, I was angry at them, and so I did exactly what they told me not to do. It's like a little child at first, really. Was a bit revolting against, to be very direct, the novels that came to me when I was growing up. Philip Roth, you know, the big Jewish novels, Malamud, early Norman Mailer, where I just thought they were superfluous. I wasn't really interested in these characters. I wasn't interested in the beautiful sentences of John Updike. I found very little pleasure in reading them.
Did you ask, did you take it further? Why didn't you? Why weren't you interested in?
I felt the culture was an imposition.
What exactly do you mean by that?
That I was being given, when I went to school, it was always great culture. This is how you should think. This is a great work of art. It was the same thing with the formal art in the art world. And it didn't have anything to do with me. I mean, and this is what I really want to explore, to, in a way, have more power over Alan or to let him have more power over me. I mean, there are various relations that come out of this. I mean, one is the way in which I feel I have power in the relationship is that I can give Alan a great deal of sexual pleasure. And I often feel that men get their power over me by pleasing me a great deal, so I feel there's a discrepancy there in our power. However, I feel that Alan, in certain ways, has his power on me because I've behaved badly toward him by sending him that work and by using him so he can play on my guilt feelings a great deal. And I think the physical ways we relate are interesting for those reasons. I'm a prose writer on the whole, even though I come out of poetry circle back in New York City. And because I'm the kind of prose writer I am, that is, I'm interested in narrative, I have to give you the background of the stories that I read. Last year, Toulouse-Lautrec, that is me, I put down sort of the story of my life. And in the beginning what happened is, well, you know about Toulouse-Lautrec, that he's a hunchback and very ugly, or she, I rather should say. And poor Toulouse was living in Paris in the 19th century. And because Toulouse, myself, I'm a hunchback and a dwarf, I can't really get laid or anything. In fact, I have this horrible problem. I also have these horribly ugly genitals. So I hang out with the other artists, such as Van Gogh and Theo Van Gogh, my friend, at this brothel, where I called Norvin's Brothel. And one day, getting hornier and hornier, what happens is I decide that I'm going to join the brothel so that I can get laid, because at least if I'm a whore, then when people come, you know, maybe there'll be these people who want some kind of perverted whatever, and they'll pick me. So now this brothel is full of men. All the prostitutes are men, though I'm a woman. And all the main whores in the brothel are named Rhys Chatham and Garrett List and Peter Gordon. So we're all sitting around one night in the brothel after work. This is the scene. And it's very dark, just like this. And we don't know what to do because we're very tired. We've had a long day's work. But we can't get to sleep because we still have that kind of funny, frenetic energy you get when you fuck too much. So what we do to get each other to sleep, since we can't fuck or anything because we're so sick of it, is we tell each other fairy tales. And what I'm going to read you is the second fairy tale, which I, Toulouse, tell to everybody else, to you, the whores, to get you to sleep. Fear, like an electric shock, ran through my body as Bill turned the car onto the deserted country road. I knew what was coming, the grand finish toward which the events of the evening had been leading. I hadn't tried to stop it. Deep down inside, I knew that it was what I really wanted. And as the car bumped down the old dirt road, I prayed inwardly that this time everything would work out, that I would be able to go through with it. Bravely, I tried to fight down the familiar feeling of terror, but the attempt was useless. Slowly, surely, it began to take control of me, increasing as we rocked closer and closer to the end of the road. I watched Bill as he drove, wondering if he had any idea of the way I felt. No, of course not. He thought I was just another girl, maybe prettier than most, but basically like everybody else. He had no idea of the struggle going on inside my head, or the dark secret that lay in my past. But I knew that all too soon he would find out what I was really like, that he would be gone also, just like all the others. We were near the end of the road, and Bill slowed the car to a stop along the side. He switched off the lights. Then, stretching his arms above his head, he gave a long, contented sigh. "Wow," he said, "it's a terrific night. Listen to the birds." "I am," I said, trying to sound calm, even though my heart was beating so violently I could hardly even speak. Bill turned his face to me and smiled. It was dark, and I could barely make out his features. His light brown hair looked black. The moonlight, glittering in his eyes, hid their blue and turned his freckled face ash white. Although I knew he was good-looking, the darkness made him seem more a monster than a man. Without wanting to, I started to shake. Bill reached out and put his hand lightly on my leg. "What's the matter? Are you cold?" Yes, a little," I answered quietly, even though my inner voice was screaming, "No, I'm not cold, you fool. I'm scared half to death." In Nova Express and The Ticket That Exploded, and some of the smaller works, you talked a lot about the methods of cut-up and the fold-in method and other methods. Is the montage that you're doing these pictures, does the procedure resemble some of the methods back in those days?
It does, very definitely, in that the cut-up introduced into writing a random factor, a cut of the scissors.
Right.
And here we have, in some cases, the blast of a shotgun producing an explosion of color, either hitting a tube of paint or a can of spray paint, which produces an explosion of color across the surface of quite unpredictable patterns. But this, of course, is not such a new thing in painting. It was done by Pollock, by Yves Klein, and I'm sure by others, letting paint drip down the canvas to form these random, unpredictable patterns. That doesn't rule out very careful brushwork. I think Pollock was a very careful artist, too.
The men were of all stripes and all sizes. Depending on whether it was the right guy, then the S&M followed, or not.
Kneel down, girl. Prepare yourself, for you're now going to experience the sufferings that are in this world. That are this world. You have to learn how to stop grasping so that you can ascend into heaven. I hadn't known that Buddhists believed in heaven. A door creaked, then hands blinding me drew aside the clothes that I had thrown across my body to protect myself from the bitter cold. My ass was bared. My asshole. I've been told that when my asshole opens, it looks like a rose blooming. Is it true, as Buddhists say, that appearances are deceptive? Answer. My pirates dwell in freedom.
Saw. This here is Antigone. Antigone speaking about herself.
Antigone went wild, 'cause Oedipus was blind. Antigone went wild.